Just a few days ago, we celebrated the anniversary of Yetziat Mitzrayim, a day that bore not only witness to our freedom from slavery, but also marked the beginning of our transformation from a loose amalgam of tribes into a soon-to-be nation. And yet, despite that extraordinary event and the year-long series of miracles that preceded it, did you ever notice the very first thing that God did? It wasn't the splitting of the sea, nor some other glorious wonder to accompany the Exodus. Rather, the very first thing God did after Pharaoh sent us away was he doubted us. God questioned our faith and our allegiance, and therefore chose a route for us that led out of Egypt, but not directly to Eretz Yisrael, ki karovhu, because the direct route would be too close, and maybe, just maybe, pen yinachem ha'am birotam milchama v'shavu mitzrayma. The people would see a war, not even be part of a war, but see a war and flee back to Egypt. At least that's the way that Rashi understood the text. But the Rambam suggested something different. He wrote that God didn't doubt our faith. Rather, he wanted us to travel a more circuitous route to ensure that we would have the much needed time and experience to transform ourselves from slaves to free people. Because as the Rambam wrote in his Moreh Nevuchim, it may have taken only one night to leave Egypt, but ultimately it took 40 years for Egypt to leave them. But even more, noted the Rambam, this longer route gave us the time to prepare for war, prepare to fight the people of Canaan, or in the Rambam's words, but for their misery and weariness in the desert, they would not have been able to conquer the lands and to fight, which does suggest that God's opinion of us was better than what Rashi wrote. It wasn't that we were untrustworthy, merely an inexperienced people. And yet, I would like to suggest an alternative. Based on the phrase, ki karovhu, because it was close, and an unusual comment offered by one of the great Baalei Tosafot, Rabbi Yitzchak Midampierre, the 12th century nephew and student of Rabbeinu Tam, and the great-grandson of Rashi. Quoting his father, Reb Shmuel, the Ria Zaken explained that when crossing the Red Sea, the Jews didn't travel through the sea from one bank of the river to the next. Instead, Ritzua achat avru vayam la'orech hayam. They walked a single path along the length of the sea and parallel to the land. Ad shepanu lemidbar litzad echad, until they turned back towards the desert on the very same side, which is the reason we ultimately had to travel through the lands of Edom and Moab, entering Eretz Yisrael from the east and not the south, because we never crossed the sea, according to Tosafot, and had no choice but to take a circuitous route. But why? What was the point of this? Why didn't God let us cross the sea and go into the land from the south? Maybe the answer is ki karovhu, because God wanted us to remain close to Egypt. Not that God didn't want to take us out of Egypt, because he did. Instead, God wanted us to be near Egypt a little longer. Why? Perhaps to keep the Jews a little on edge, to let our ancestors know that while they were free, they were not out of the woods, at least not yet. And maybe even to make sure there still was a bit of concern, a little bit of nervousness, and maybe even a little bit of fear. Because to be triumphant sometimes is more dangerous than to be at risk. And to be triumphant, to have crossed the sea and be rid of an enemy, could have left us open to other, even more dangerous threats, the threats of complacency and contentment, self regard, and maybe even undue pride. And so God dropped us off almost where He picked us up. He saved us from the Egyptian army's immediate threat, but let us know that there was still so much more to do, so much further to travel. And maybe that's what He meant by kikarovu. Not that the proximity to Egypt was bad, but that strangely, it was good. And I share with you this somewhat unconventional reading of the text for two reasons. The first is the obvious. In response to what some view as the triumph of our Orthodox community. For while our Orthodox community is growing and succeeding in ways that no one could have ever imagined 2 or 3 or 4 decades ago, we're not winning. Because overall, the Jewish community is shrinking, and assimilation and intermarriage, while a minor problem among Orthodox Jews, is an existential threat to American Jewry. And if, God forbid, our non-Orthodox brethren disappear, we will lose millions of Jews. And so while we succeed, we need to reach out and bring others along with us, recognizing that not every Jew will be observant, at least not yet. And nevertheless, every Jew possesses a precious neshama from God. We need to find a way to set aside our triumphalism, our false sense of victory, and see that there never was a war we could win and our fellow Jews could lose. Only a struggle in which we're all losing, and we must find a way to turn the tide before it is too late. Because to be triumphant sometimes is more dangerous than to be at risk. And the second reason hits even closer to home, because it addresses our own lives, our families, our children, our spouses. Baruch Hashem, we live at a time of great opportunity and achievement, a time when the struggles for survival that our grandparents and great-grandparents had to endure, the hunger, poverty, disease, and persecution are so very rare that we've allowed ourselves the luxury of even imagining their lives as idyllic scenes that are only found in hagiographic biographies of the Orthodox press or on the sound stages of the movies and television. We live so confidently and we enjoy so much that it can lead, and it has led, to a sense of complacency, self-centeredness, and even triumphalism. And if, God forbid, it happens, or if it has happened, everything we have, and especially the relationships that we cherish, our families, our communities, God forbid, can fail. Because life is not about sitting back and regaling in the accomplishments of the past. Rather, life is about caring for others, being with others, making time for the people we cherish, and finding ways to make our relationships with others and with God deeper and more meaningful. And nothing is a greater proof of this than Pesach, the most intense and exhausting of all holidays we observe, but also, in a direct measure, the most meaningful, most memorable, and most transformative. Because Pesach doesn't just happen unless if we make it happen. And life doesn't just happen. We have to make it happen. We live at a time that God has blessed us with so much. But as the Netziv once commented on the opening line of the Birkat Kohanim, the words, Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, that it really shouldn't be translated as, may God bless you and protect you, but rather, may God grant you blessings and may he protect you from those blessings. Because whether we're blessed with wealth, with loving families, with communities that care, we need to work to protect those blessings, to make sure that we don't take them for granted, to assume that just because ki karovu, that they'll always be within our reach. This Shabbat is the anniversary of when our ancestors stood on the banks of the Yam Suf and sang to God, not because the journey before them would be simple, but because they felt God's presence in their lives, his protection and his eternity. They sang then, and we continue to sing, but not because we've made it, but rather because we've come so far that we know how to continue to travel. So let's cherish all that we have, but never be triumphant. Because to be triumphant is to focus on today and not tomorrow, on ourselves and not on others, on a euphoric moment of achievement and not on the eternal challenges of life. To be triumphant is to risk it all, kikarovu, thinking that life will always be fulfilling, even if we let it just pass us by. Let us enjoy and let us work to make that enjoyment, those relationships, all the more powerful. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.